The late autumn air is so cold it feels like a shard of glass in the lungs. In the stark moonlight, Elias Thorne's breath plumes before him, the only ghost in a silent world. He crouches behind the weathered split-rail fence, his shotgun resting in the crook of his arm, its metal icy against his skin. This is the third night. The third night he has waited for the thief who has been stealing his chickens, one by one, leaving nothing but a few scattered feathers and a gnawing sense of violation. He is not a wealthy man. His ranch is a hard-bitten piece of land that takes more than it gives. Each chicken is a dozen eggs, a future meal, a small victory against the encroaching wilderness. Losing them is like losing blood. A twig snaps near the coop. Elias's body goes rigid, every muscle pulled taut. He rises slowly, a tall, gaunt shadow detaching from the deeper shadows of the barn. He sees a figure, small and hunched, slipping through the broken slat in the coop door. There is no sound but the frantic, muffled clucking of the hens. He waits until the figure emerges, a limp bird clutched in one hand, and then he steps out, blocking the path to the woods. "That's far enough," he says. His voice is a low rumble, rusty from disuse. The figure freezes, a gasp cutting through the stillness. It's a woman. Even in the pale light, he can see the desperation etched on her face, the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the terror in her wide eyes. She looks like a startled deer, ready to bolt, yet frozen by the hunter's gaze. Well, that's one way to meet. Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. She is young, maybe 30, with hair the color of straw sticking out from under a threadbare shawl. The chicken, its life already fled, dangles from her grip. Her eyes dart from his face to the shotgun and back again. She says nothing, her lips pressed into a thin, white line of resignation. She is preparing for the righteous anger, the sheriff, the jail cell. He takes a step closer, his boots crunching on the frosted ground, and his anger, so carefully nursed for 3 nights, begins to curdle into something else. This isn't the face of a hardened thief. It's the face of utter despair. And then, from the dark fringe of the woods behind her, comes a sound that changes everything. The thin, reedy cough of a small child. And with that sound, the simple act of theft became a question he had no answer for. He lowered the shotgun, the weight of it suddenly feeling immense. The woman flinched, but her eyes, dark pools of misery, never left his. She clutched the dead hen to her chest, as if it were a shield. "Who's out there?" Elias asked, his voice softer now, less an accusation and more a weary inquiry. She shook her head, a small, frantic motion. "No one. Just me." The lie was so fragile it barely stood up in the cold air. Another cough, weaker this time, drifted from the trees. Elias looked past her, his gaze piercing the gloom. He saw movement, the barest whisper of it, a small shape pulling back behind a gnarled juniper. He sighed, the sound a ragged cloud in the moonlight. "Ma'am, a lie is a poor currency out here. Best not to spend it." He gestured with his head toward the woods. "Bring them out." For a long moment, she stood her ground, a statue of defiance and fear. He could see the war in her eyes. Then, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She turned and made a soft, cooing sound, a noise a mother bird might make to its brood. From the darkness, they emerged. Not one, but 4 small figures, stepping into the pale moonlight like wraiths. They were impossibly small, their faces pinched and pale, their clothes little more than layered rags. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 8, stood protectively in front of 2 younger girls, while the smallest, a girl who couldn't be more than 4, clung to the woman's worn skirt, her tiny body racked by the cough he'd heard. Elias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. His simple problem of a chicken thief had just become a monstrous, complicated thing. The anger had evaporated completely, replaced by a cold, heavy weight in his gut. He looked at the dead hen in the woman's arms, then at the hungry, haunted eyes of the children. Starving. They were starving. "My name is Elias Thorne," he said quietly, setting the shotgun down to lean against the fence post. It felt important that his hands be empty. "Annalise Croft," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "My husband he passed in the spring. The fever." He nodded slowly. He knew the Croft place, a small, failed homestead a few miles east, choked with weeds and sorrow. He hadn't known Samuel Croft had a wife, let alone this. And these children. Her gaze dropped to the tops of their heads. There, they were from the wagon train. The one that got hit with cholera 2 months back. Their folks didn't make it. The town didn't have a place for them. I couldn't just leave them. So she had taken them in, a widow with nothing, inheriting a legacy of mouths to feed. He understood now. The single chickens, taken one at a time over several nights. It wasn't greed, it was careful, desperate rationing. He looked at his coop, full of clucking, healthy birds, and felt a hot spike of shame. Go on, he said, his voice thick. Take it. Annalise stared at him, bewildered. What? The chicken, he clarified, nodding toward her hands. It's yours. And this, he walked into the coop, the hens scattering before him. He grabbed a burlap sack from a hook and began filling it with eggs, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He came back out and pressed the heavy sack into her arms. There's a root cellar behind the barn. Go wait there. It's warmer. She looked at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign tongue. Trust was a language she had clearly forgotten. Go on, he urged, his tone leaving no room for argument. Get the children out of the cold. She finally nodded, a jerky, uncertain movement, and herded her small, silent flock toward the dark stone door of the cellar. Elias watched them go, a procession of shadows swallowed by the earth. He picked up his shotgun and walked back to his house, the familiar lines of his solitary life now feeling strange and porous. He stoked the fire in the hearth, put a large pot of water on to boil, and went to his pantry. He pulled out potatoes, onions, a slab of salted pork, and the last of the bread he'd baked 3 days ago. For the first time in 5 years, since his Martha had been laid to rest on the hill overlooking the creek, he was cooking for more than one. He carried the steaming pot of stew out to the cellar. The stone door creaked open under his hand. The scene inside was a painter's tragic masterpiece. Annalise had them huddled together under her own thin shawl, their small bodies trembling. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The smell of damp earth and desperation was thick in the air. When he set the pot down, the aroma of hot food filled the small space, and the children's eyes, which had been dull with exhaustion, widened with a fierce, animal hunger. He didn't stay to watch them eat. It felt like an intrusion, like watching something too private and raw. He left the lantern, a loaf of bread, and 5 wooden bowls he'd carved himself. There's blankets in the loft of the barn, he said to Annalise from the doorway. Get them settled in the hay. It's warmer than this place. He closed the door and walked back into the night. The moon seemed brighter, the air colder. His ranch, which had always felt like a fortress of solitude, now felt like something else entirely. A sanctuary. And that new, unfamiliar feeling scared him more than any thief in the night. The arrangement, unspoken and undefined, settled into a routine. Every morning, Annalise would appear at his back door, the oldest boy, Thomas, trailing behind her. She never knocked. She simply waited, a wraith of quiet dignity, until he acknowledged her. He would give her eggs, a pail of milk from his lone cow, and whatever else he could spare, a handful of dried beans, a few wrinkled apples from the bottom of the barrel. She would nod her thanks, her eyes never quite meeting his, and disappear back into the cavernous warmth of the barn. He learned the children's names through quiet observation. Thomas, the solemn 8-year-old who tried to carry himself like a man. Sarah and June, the twin girls of about 6, who moved as one entity, their hands always linked. And Lily, the smallest, whose cough had subsided in the dry hay, but who still watched him with the wary, ancient eyes of a creature who had seen too much. Elias found himself altering his own routines. He started gathering more wood than he needed, leaving a stack near the barn door. He found an old cast-iron stove in a junk pile and spent a full day cleaning it, running a new pipe out a high window in the loft so they could have proper heat. He didn't tell Annalise he was doing it. She simply came back one afternoon to find the stove installed, a small fire already crackling within. She said nothing, but the next morning, he found a neatly mended tear in one of his work shirts, left folded on the porch railing. It was a silent conversation, a barter of need and provision, of quiet gratitude and gruff compassion. The town, however, was not silent. Word traveled on the wind in a place like Harmony Creek. Elias Thorne, the widower recluse, had taken in a vagrant woman and a pack of stray children. He saw it in the way Mr. Abernathy, the general store owner, looked at him over the rim of his spectacles, a mixture of pity and disapproval. He heard it in the sudden hush that fell over the saloon when he walked in for his weekly bottle of whiskey. One afternoon, Sheriff Brody cornered him outside the feed store. Brody was a man whose authority was derived more from the shine on his badge than any inner steel. "Elias," he began, shifting his weight uneasily. "Folks are talking." "Folks always are," Elias replied, hefting a sack of grain onto his shoulder. "They're saying you've got that Croft woman and a mess of orphans living in your barn. The town council ain't pleased. They see it as encouraging squatters." "They're not squatters," Elias said, his voice flat and hard. "They're under my protection." Brody held up his hands. "Look, I ain't saying you're wrong to help. But she was a thief. And those children, they ain't your responsibility. There's talk of sending them to the county workhouse. It might be for the best." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. The workhouse. He'd heard stories of the place. Cold, cruel, a place where children's spirits were broken before their bodies were grown. He pictured Lily's small, pale face, Sarah and June's linked hands, Thomas's fierce, protective glare. "That won't be happening," Elias said, the words coming out like chips of granite. "You tell the council that if they want those children, they have to come through me." The sheriff's eyes widened slightly at the cold fury in Elias's tone. He nodded, backing away. "Just telling you what's being said, Elias. Be careful." The threat settled a new kind of chill over the ranch. It wasn't the cold of winter, but the ice of men's laws and judgments. He looked at the barn, now a warm, living place filled with the faint sounds of children's whispers, and he knew his haphazard charity was no longer enough. A stack of firewood and a pail of milk wouldn't stand up to the town council. They needed a shield, something official and unbreakable. That evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, he walked to the barn. The warm, yellow light from the stove spilled out from the high window. Inside, Annalise was telling the children a story. Her voice, low and melodic, was a sound he'd never heard from her before. It was a voice free of fear. He listened for a moment, his hand on the rough-hewn door, feeling like an intruder on a sacred peace. He pushed the door open. The storytelling stopped. For pairs of small eyes, and one pair of guarded, adult ones, turned to him. "Annalise," he said, his voice sounding overloud in the quiet space. "I need to talk with you." She followed him out into the twilight, pulling her shawl tight against the biting wind. They stood by the fence, the same fence where he had first confronted her. "Sheriff Brody paid me a visit," he began, not looking at her. He stared out at the dark line of the mountains. "The town council. They're talking about the workhouse. For the children." He felt her stiffen beside him. He heard her sharp intake of breath. "They can't," she whispered, a desperate plea to the uncaring sky. "I won't let them." "Your will isn't enough to stop them," he said, his tone blunt but not unkind. "Neither is mine." Not as things stand, he finally turned to face her. In the fading light, he could see the tracks of fresh tears on her dusty cheeks. "They see a vagrant woman and stray children. They don't see a family. We need to give them something they can't argue with. Something that makes this place their legal home." She looked at him, her expression a mess of confusion and dawning horror. "What are you saying?" Elias took a deep breath, the cold air burning all the way down. The idea had been a spark, then a flicker, and now a steady, resolute flame in his mind. It was insane. It was illogical, but it was the only thing he could think of that would work. "I'm saying," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest, "that the law protects a wife. It protects a man's children. They can't take a man's family from his own property." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "Marry me, Annalise." She stared at him, speechless. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face. He saw not shock, but a deep, profound sorrow in her eyes, as if he had just proposed another kind of prison. You can't mean that," she stammered. "As a charity? A business transaction? I can't accept that." "This isn't charity," he said, and he was surprised to find he meant it. "This is a partnership. I need help on this ranch. It's too much for one man. Thomas is old enough to learn. You can run the house. It's been empty too long." He was talking about practicality, about work and shelter, but underneath it, a different truth was stirring. The silence of his house had become deafening since he'd grown accustomed to the sounds of life from the barn. "I'm not offering you a handout, Annalise. I'm offering you a stockade, a wall to keep the world out. And maybe," he added, his voice dropping so low it was nearly lost to the wind, "I'm tired of being the only one on watch." She searched his face for a long time, looking for the pity, the condescension. But all she found was a raw, weary honesty that mirrored her own. She thought of the workhouse, of Lily's cough returning in the damp cold, of her small family being torn apart. Then she looked at this hard, quiet man who had given them food when they were starving, warmth when they were freezing, and was now offering them the one thing she thought they would never have again, a name and a place to stand their ground. "All right, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but firm as the frozen earth beneath their feet. "All right." The wedding was a stark, hurried affair. They stood before the circuit judge in his dusty office in town, the children lined up behind them like solemn little witnesses. Elias wore a clean shirt, and Annalise had mended her one good dress, a faded calico that hung loosely on her thin frame. The judge, a man named Peters, looked them over with an air of weary disinterest, eager to get to his midday meal. He mumbled the words, his voice droning on until he got to the part that mattered. When he pronounced them man and wife, a heavy silence fell over the room. Elias felt a strange, unfamiliar tremor in his hand as he signed the ledger. Annalise's signature beside his was a delicate, spidery script, the hand of an educated woman. It was another small mystery about her. He paid the judge, and they walked out into the harsh sunlight of Harmony Creek's main street, a legally bound family of strangers. Mr. Abernathy was sweeping the boardwalk in front of his store. He stopped, his broom frozen mid-swipe, as he saw them emerge from the judge's office. His jaw went slack. The news would be all over town by nightfall. Elias met his gaze with a look as hard and unyielding as iron, and Abernathy quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in a crack in the wooden planks. Moving them from the barn to the house was another silent, significant act. Annalise and the children crossed the 100 yards of packed earth as if crossing an ocean. They entered the house that had been Martha's domain, a place Elias had kept preserved in amber and dust for 5 years. Annalise stopped in the doorway, her eyes taking in the sparse, clean room, the cold hearth, the faint scent of wood smoke and loneliness. "There are 2 rooms upstairs," Elias said, his voice gruff as he tried to fill the cavernous silence. "The girls can take one. Thomas, the other. There's a cot." He pointed to the small room off the kitchen. "That can be yours." He had expected to feel a sense of violation, of Martha's memory being trespassed upon. Instead, as the children explored their new surroundings with wide, curious eyes, the house seemed to exhale. The floors creaked with life. Lily let out a small, delighted gasp when she discovered a rag doll with a missing button eye on a dusty shelf, one of Martha's. She hugged it to her chest, and for the first time, Elias saw a real smile on the child's face. It was like watching a winter flower bloom in the snow. The days that followed were an awkward dance of proximity. They shared meals at the long wooden table, the scrape of cutlery and the children's hushed whispers the only sounds. Annalise, true to her word, transformed the house. Dust vanished. The scent of baking bread began to fill the rooms. She found Martha's old sewing basket and set to work mending the children's clothes, and then Elias's, her needle moving with a swift, quiet efficiency. She asked for nothing, but her presence, and the presence of the children, began to fill the empty spaces in his life, both in the house and in his heart. He taught Thomas how to mend fences and feed the livestock. The boy was a quick study, his small face set with a fierce determination to earn his keep. He watched Annalise with the girls, saw her teaching them their letters using a charred stick on a piece of slate. He saw the gentle way she brushed their hair, the soft stories she told them by the fire at night. He saw a mother, fierce and tender. The town, for a time, seemed to hold its breath. His marriage had stunned them into a resentful silence. But the quiet was not peace, it was the calm before a storm. The first gust came in the form of the Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was as thin as his lips. He arrived one Sunday afternoon, his Bible clutched in his white-knuckled hand. "Mr. Thorne," he said, refusing to step inside, forcing Elias and Annalise to stand on their own porch like supplicants. "The congregation is concerned. This marriage, so sudden, to a woman of questionable history. It sets a poor example. My marriage is a matter for God and myself, Reverend, not for the congregation," Elias said, his voice dangerously low. Annalise stood beside him, her face pale but her back straight. "And the children?" the Reverend pressed, his eyes cold. "They are not your blood. The county has a place for such unfortunates. A proper, Christian place." "Their place is here," Annalise said, her voice shaking but clear. It was the first time she had spoken directly to one of their accusers. "They are my children, and this is their home." The Reverend's lips tightened. "Pride is a sin, Mrs. Thorne. The town provides for its own. It does not look kindly on those who invite destitution into its midst. The Lord helps those who help themselves. The Lord also tells us to care for the widow and the orphan," Elias countered, stepping slightly in front of Annalise. "Or is that a page you've skipped in your reading, Reverend? Now, unless you've come to offer a blessing, you're trespassing." Reverend Miller paled at the dismissal, his self-righteousness curdling into malice. "You will regret this, Thorne. The good people of this town will not stand for it." He turned and stalked away, leaving a toxic silence in his wake. The confrontation solidified their fragile alliance into something stronger. That night, sitting by the fire, Annalise looked at him, her eyes shining in the flickering light. "Thank you," she said softly. "He was wrong," Elias replied, staring into the flames. "Many people think he's right," she said. "They don't understand." "Then let them be ignorant," he grumbled. But he knew it wasn't that simple. The Reverend's visit was a declaration of war. The town council, led by men like Abernathy and spurred on by Miller's venom, would not let the matter rest. Their new life, so carefully constructed, was built on a fault line, and the tremors were just beginning. The first snow came, a fine, dusting powder that outlined every branch and fence post in white. With it came the final escalation. Sheriff Brody rode up to the ranch, not alone this time. Behind him were Abernathy and two other grim-faced men from the town council. They stayed on their horses, a clear and deliberate show of authority. Elias met them in the yard, his hands empty but his stance rigid. Annalise appeared in the doorway of the house, the four children clustered behind her skirts, their faces pressed against her legs. "Elias," Brody said, avoiding his eyes. "The council has filed a formal petition with the county magistrate. They're claiming these children are neglected, living with a former thief. They're claiming the marriage is a sham to circumvent the law." "It's a lie," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "Look at them. They're warm. They're fed. This is their home." "The magistrate has issued an order," Abernathy cut in, his voice sharp with vindictive triumph. "We're to take the children to the county seat. They'll be placed in the workhouse until a proper home can be found." Annalise let out a small, strangled cry. Thomas stepped out from behind her, his small fists clenched. "You can't," he yelled, his voice cracking with a boy's impotent fury. "That's enough," Brody said, finally looking at Elias, a flicker of shame in his eyes. "We have the law on our side, Elias. Don't make this difficult." Two of the men dismounted, starting toward the porch. This was it. The moment everything would break. Elias felt a cold, clean rage settle over him. He had built this life, this sanctuary, with his own two hands, and he would not see it torn down by the petty fears of small men. But before he could move, Annalise did something unexpected. She stepped forward, past the threshold, putting herself between the men and her children. She was no longer the frightened, desperate woman from the chicken coop. Her shoulders were back, her chin was up, and her eyes, which had for so long been downcast, now blazed with a fire that made the councilman hesitate. "You will not touch them," she said, her voice ringing with a strength no one in the yard had ever heard from her. It was the voice of a mother bear defending her cubs. "You talk of the law, Mr. Abernathy. You quote rules from your comfortable town, but you know nothing of the laws of survival. You know nothing of desperation." She turned her fiery gaze on the small crowd. "Yes, I stole a chicken. I was a thief. Because my children, and yes, they are my children, were starving. While you sat by your warm fires, they were shivering in a shack, their bellies aching with a hunger you cannot imagine. Which is the greater crime? Stealing a bird to feed a child, or letting a child starve to uphold your precious pride? The men were stunned into silence by her ferocity. She wasn't finished. And this man, she said, turning to Elias, her voice softening but losing none of its power. This man showed me a mercy this town has long since forgotten. He gave us shelter. He gave us food. He gave us his name and his protection when you offered us nothing but judgment. You call our marriage a sham? This marriage, this family, is more real and more true than any of your empty Sunday sermons, Reverend, she added, her eyes finding an imaginary Miller in the crowd. This is a home built on compassion, not on hypocrisy. She took a breath and delivered her final volley. You want to take these children? You will have to kill me first, and then you will have to get through my husband. She stepped back to stand beside Elias, placing her hand on his forearm. It was a simple gesture, but it was a declaration. A line drawn in the snow. They stood together, a united front. Elias looked at the faces of the men before him. Their certainty was gone, replaced by a grudging, uncomfortable doubt. Annalise's words had stripped them of their moral authority, leaving their prejudice bare for all to see. He looked at Annalise, at this woman he had married out of a grim sense of duty, and saw her for the first time not as a widow, not as a thief, but as a queen defending her tiny, precious kingdom. And he felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost buckled his knees. He placed his hand over hers on his arm. You heard my wife, he said, his voice calm and lethal. You've come to my home, armed with a piece of paper, to tear a family apart. I have no paper. I have only my word. And I give it to you now. No one is leaving this ranch. I suggest you get back on your horses and ride away before you learn what a man will do when everything he values is threatened. There was no bluster in his voice. It was a simple statement of fact, as solid and immovable as the mountains at his back. Brody looked from Elias's stony face to Annalise's defiant one, then at the four small children peeking out from the doorway, safe behind the wall their parents had just built. He sighed, a long, weary sound of defeat. He's right, Abernathy, the sheriff said, turning his horse. We're done here. But the magistrate's order, Abernathy sputtered. The magistrate isn't here, Brody cut him off. And I'm not the man to enforce it. Let's go. One by one, they turned their horses, their righteous crusade crumbling into a shameful retreat. They rode away, leaving nothing but tracks in the snow. The silence they left behind was vast and profound. The threat was gone. They had won. Annalise's hand was still on his arm, her fingers trembling slightly. Elias turned to her. The fire was gone from her eyes, replaced by a shimmering vulnerability. He saw the cost of her bravery. He gently led her back into the house, closing the door on the cold world outside. The children swarmed her, clinging to her skirt, their faces buried in its folds. He knelt and gathered Lily into his arms. She didn't flinch. She rested her small head on his shoulder, her little body warm against his. Later that evening, long after the children were asleep upstairs, Elias and Annalise sat at the table. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow over the room. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The battle had been won, and a deep, quiet peace had settled in its place. You called me your husband, Elias said softly into the stillness. Annalise looked up from her hands, which were folded on the table. You are, she replied simply. And you meant it, it wasn't a question. Yes, she said. A small, shy smile touched her lips. I meant it. He reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were calloused from work, but they fit in his as if they were made to be there. He thought of the cold, empty years behind him, and of the noise and warmth and life that now filled his house. He thought of this brave, fierce, gentle woman, and the family he had stumbled into in the dead of night. He had caught a thief stealing his chickens, and in the end, she had stolen his solitude, his loneliness, and his heart. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was the one who had gotten the better end of the bargain. The house was no longer just a structure, it was a home, and it was full. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.